On June 10th, 1798, French forces started landing at 4 different points on the Maltese Islands. The invasion of the approximately 316 square kilometer island nation in the middle of the Mediterranean occurred during the period of the French Revolutionary Wars, between the War of the First Coalition and the War of the Second Coalition. Although the invasion didn't take very long, it would lead to a rebellion, a prolonged siege that would send ripple effects throughout Europe and the Middle East, and would represent a turning point in the history of the island nation of Malta and the fabled chivalric order of the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. The 1798 invasion of Malta deserves to be remembered. It was not surprising that European nations coveted Malta. The archipelago was strategically located in the Mediterranean, a side trade between Europe and the Levant, and included several natural harbors. But there were particular reasons that France, under the great General Napoleon Bonaparte, was there in 1798. The island had been ruled by the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem since it was gifted to them by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in 1530. The medieval order, commonly called the Knights Hospitaller, had been driven from their stronghold on the Isle of Rhodes by an Ottoman army in 1522, and used Malta as a base to raid Ottoman shipping. The Knights had withstood another Ottoman attack, the Great Siege of Malta, in 1565. The Catholic order was weakened by the Protestant Reformation, but its stronghold in Malta endured. It was another development on the continent that threatened the Knights' rule. By 1789, 2/3 of the order were of French origin, and the order received a substantial portion of its income from commanderies, or wealthy domains of the French Knights in France. These lands were nationalized in 1792 after the overthrow of the French monarchy during the French Revolution, and the order was deprived of a significant amount of its income. Given Malta's strategic location, however, other European powers became interested in supporting the order for the purpose of gaining influence over the island. Britain, Russia, and Austria all provided various levels of support or assistance. European nations didn't just covet the island because of its location. After the Great Siege of Malta, the Knights had developed significant fortifications and watchtowers. While these had been developed over hundreds, and even in some cases thousands of years, the great bastions, notable among them the fortifications at Valletta, named after Jean Persaud de la Valette, who had been Grand Master of the Order during the Great Siege in 1565, were still formidable in the 18th century warfare. Moreover, the great fortifications defended harbors, providing a location for naval power in the Mediterranean. The new foreign interest in Malta particularly concerned France, who had historical connections to the island through the order. In fact, several of the knights had left the order in order to participate in the French Revolutionary Wars. But the island also figured prominently into the ambitious plans of revolutionary France's greatest general, Napoleon Bonaparte. At the time, France was ruled by a 5-member committee called the Directory. However, the country was in constant conflict during the period, and the Directory was dependent upon its generals. Most importantly, Napoleon, who had just successfully completed a campaign against Austria in Italy that had ended the War of the First Coalition. The defeat of Austria and the conquest of Italy had ended the coalition, but one great rival survived: Great Britain. The Directory knew that they had to defeat Britain in order to end the French Revolutionary Wars. They considered an invasion of Britain, but Napoleon determined such plans to be impossible because the British fleet dominated the English Channel. Instead, the 28-year-old Bonaparte proposed a grand scheme to take the Ottoman province of Egypt, ostensibly to protect French trade, but with the broader goal of cutting off British routes of supply to India, and creating its own route to supply troops to support their ally, the Kingdom of Mysore, on the subcontinent. Napoleon saw the campaign as the first step in a process of capturing British interests in India and thus forcing Great Britain to sue for peace. In August 1797, Napoleon wrote, "The time is not far away that we will feel that, in order to truly destroy England, we must take Egypt." While still a province of the Ottoman Empire, in reality Egypt was out of Ottoman control, and its Mamluk leaders were quarreling among themselves. Since the loss of the War of the First Coalition and the Spanish alliance with France in 1796, Britain had lost its bases in the Mediterranean, and the Royal Navy was far less a threat there than in the north. But Napoleon's plan faced significant challenges. While the British squadron in the Mediterranean was not particularly large, it was commanded by the talented Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson. Napoleon could not afford a direct conflict with the Royal Navy with his invasion fleet. Napoleon's plan depended upon secrecy, and French possession of Malta, a protected navy base between France and Egypt, was a critical component of the plan. When the French fleet, including 13 ships of the line led by the massive 118-gun flagship L'Orient, or the Orient, and including some 400 transport vessels carrying 35,000 men, left Toulon in May 1798. Its destination was unknown to the British and to all but a handful of the French. Nelson had to consider many possibilities for Napoleon's plans, and to complicate matters, a storm off of Spain separated his fleet, and his main fleet lost contact with the frigates that he needed for scouting. Still, on June 7th, Napoleon received a report that Nelson was hot on his tail. Now, Napoleon had a significant war fleet of his own, but he had to worry for his transports. He could not afford a battle at sea, and thus he was forced to rush towards Malta. They arrived off the islands on June 9th. The French arrival created a difficult situation for the knights. While they had received warning that Napoleon planned to take the island, the Grand Master, Ferdinand von Hompesch zu Bolheim, had not taken the warnings seriously and had done nothing to reinforce the island's defenses. In addition, France was a Christian nation, making it difficult for him to refuse them safe harbor, despite it being clear that they had hostile intent. When the French were first sighted, the Grand Master called up the Maltese militia and called a council of war. When the French admiral requested safe harbor, the council decided to offer only to allow 4 French ships into the harbor, applying an old statute that limited the number of ships a nation may take into the harbor in a time of war. This presented a problem to Napoleon. He had been told that Nelson was close behind, and only taking in 4 ships would leave his transports vulnerable. While his intention always seems to have been to take the island, it is possible that there may have been a period of negotiation, but the suspected position of the British fleet forced him to act. In fact, the information was incorrect, and Nelson did not know his location and was nowhere near Malta. Napoleon responded to the knights with an ultimatum. He expressed his intent to take the islands, emphasized the superiority of his force, and suggested that the Grand Master make arrangements to avoid hostilities, or in other words, surrender the islands. The following day, the French invaded. While the knights and Maltese militia were outnumbered and their defenses neglected, the fortifications could have offered a stout defense. Instead, there was only sporadic resistance. Some forts held well, even against determined bombardment, but French landings largely met only token resistance. There are multiple reasons for the quick defeat of the Knights of Malta. The defenders suffered from a lack of ammunition and supply, had difficulty in handling large numbers of civilians seeking protection, and there was a failure of leadership among an order whose military wing had not been used in centuries. The knights were conflicted regarding fighting a Christian opponent, and some, including the order's treasurer, refused to fight against the French. There are conflicting stories. Some argue that the French were assisted by a Maltese uprising against the order. 2 knights were killed by a mob, and a Maltese citizens did petition the Grand Master to seek an armistice. But on the other hand, Maltese defenders claim that some well-placed French knights, at critical defense points and within the navy, deliberately undermined the defense, and that the call for an armistice only occurred after it was clear that the knights were unwilling to support a defense of the island. One Maltese witness wrote, "The Maltese were not the traitors, but the ones betrayed." The main defense of the harbor in Valletta initially held, but with the loss of the rest of Malta, the order considered the cause hopeless, and opened negotiations with Napoleon to surrender the islands. The entire Maltese archipelago and all the fortifications were surrendered to France, as were most of the military and financial assets of the order. Individual property of the knights was supposed to be protected, and they abandoned the island carrying what they could. Napoleon stayed on Malta for 6 days before taking his fleet to Egypt, leaving behind a garrison of 4,000 troops. The transfer was completed June 13th, just 5 days after the French fleet arrived. While the conquest of Malta was quick, its implications were broad and surprising. For the French, the conquest ended up being of little importance. While Napoleon conducted a bruising campaign in Egypt, Nelson caught up with his fleet, and in August 1878, outsailed and soundly defeated the French fleet in the Battle of the Nile, a battle in which the magazine exploded on the French flagship L'Orient. Generally considered one of the most decisive naval victories of the Age of Sail, the destruction of the French fleet left Napoleon's army without support and encouraged the Ottoman Empire to ally with Britain. While Napoleon fought a largely successful campaign in Egypt, he knew that his army was slowly being ground down. After winning the Battle of Aboukir in July 1799, he elected to leave for France. The army left behind continued to fight for another 2 years before finally being defeated by a combined British and Ottoman force, capitulating in September 1801. The dreams of a French Egypt leading to a conquest of British India faded, making the conquest of Malta irrelevant to French plans. The campaign had significant impacts, however. French reforms and the introduction of technologies like the printing press transformed views in Egypt and are seen by many historians as marking the beginnings of the modern Middle East. French scientific discoveries, most notably the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, sparked a greater understanding of ancient Egyptian history and European interest in studying Egypt, generally recognized as the beginning of the field of Egyptology. Ironically, virtually all the artifacts found by the French in Egypt were claimed by the British. Events in Europe had resulted in the second of the French Revolutionary Wars, in the War of the Second Coalition. But French actions in Egypt had drawn in the Ottoman Empire, and in Malta had drawn in Russia. Thus, Napoleon's attempt to finish the First Coalition helped to give rise to the Second Coalition. Moreover, the reputation gained by the victory at Aboukir, before it became clear that the campaign in Egypt was a failure, helped to propel Napoleon to overthrow the Directorate in a coup d'etat in November 1799, making himself ruler of France and transforming the nature of the French Revolution. While other events overtook France, the conquest did profoundly affect Malta. While the occupying French initially brought republican reforms, there was growing discontent over financial issues. When the French started to seize church property to help pay for the Egyptian campaign, the largely Catholic population was outraged. By September, the population went into revolt. Outnumbered, the French sought refuge behind the walls of Valletta. Britain, along with allies Naples and Portugal, assisted, blockading the island to prevent the French from getting supply. The Maltese suffered greatly, but the French eventually starved. The garrison surrendered September 3, 1780. Of the 812 days that the French had occupied Malta, 729 had been spent besieged. Under the terms of the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, which ended the French Revolutionary Wars, Malta was to be returned to the Knights. But England, suspicious of Napoleon's intent and cognizant of a declaration by the Maltese seeking to remain under the protection and sovereignty of the King of the Free People, His Majesty the King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, never relinquished the island. Dispute over that failure was one of the many issues that brought Europe to war again in 1803, starting the War of the Third Coalition, the first of the Napoleonic Wars. Malta officially became a British protectorate under the 1814 Treaty of Paris. As a British outpost, Malta figured significantly in both the First and Second World Wars. Malta became an independent state in 1964. While Napoleon had promised to provide an appropriate principality for the Knights, he never did, and the British did not return Malta. The Knights dispersed throughout Europe as the order's finances were greatly reduced to just a few European holdings. Tsar Paul I of Russia respected the chivalric order and restored their previous Polish priory in St. Petersburg. Many of the Knights sought refuge there. Many of the Knights were disgusted with Grandmaster Hompesch and demanded his resignation. He sent letters of resignation to the Holy Roman Emperor and to Tsar Paul, but not to the Pope, leaving the actual resignation in question. Members of the St. Petersburg Priory nominated the Tsar to lead the order, which was a break with tradition, as all previous Grandmasters had been unmarried Catholic Knights of the Order, and Paul was none of the three. Still, Paul took the appointment seriously, and his demands to return Malta to the order put him at odds first with the French and then the British. The threat of retaliation by the British, as well as his order to hold his nobility to a chivalric code and dissatisfaction among the ruling class over various reforms, gave rise to a conspiracy whose members assassinated Paul in his bedroom in March 1801. Some of the Knights of St. John were involved in the plot. His successor, his son Alexander, was not interested in the order, did not want to tie his fate to Malta, and so refused the title Grand Master. While the invasion and occupation of Malta in the end did little for Napoleon, it did have broad-ranging effects. It affected the next 160 years of Maltese history and thus became important in the world wars of the 20th century. It was a central point of contention among the shifting alliances of the Napoleonic era, and it shattered one of the few periods of fragile peace during that era. It helped to bring the rise of a new Tsar in Russia, and while Alexander changed his position towards France 4 different times between 1804 and 1812, from neutrality to peace to an alliance to war, it was Russia under Alexander who played a critical role in the final defeat of Napoleon. The invasion also transformed the already anachronistic chivalric order of the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. The Knights dispersed and the order faded away. Its most direct descendant is the Catholic lay organization, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, which is based in Rome, but there are various other organizations who claim to have been descended of the Knights Hospitaller in different ways. And the order, or rather multiple organizations descended from the order, became again service organizations dedicated to hospital and welfare services, in keeping with the original intent of the Knights Hospitaller. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.